You're a young American pilot, barely out of flight school. The air around you is a furnace, thick with dust and the stink of burnt oil. Below, the North African desert stretches out, a vast, unforgiving wasteland. And ahead, closing in at an impossible speed, is a silhouette that chills your blood, the Messerschmitt Bf 109. In its cockpit sits a hunter, a German ace, a man with dozens of kills to his name. He's been told your plane, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, is a joke, a clumsy, obsolete flying brick. And as he dives, you can almost feel his contempt. But he's made a fatal mistake. He's underestimated you. He's underestimated your machine. And he's about to fly directly into the storm of 6.50 caliber machine guns. This is not a story about a superior weapon. This is a story about a superior spirit. This is the story of how the German aces mocked the P-40 Warhawk until its 6 guns shredded their Bf 109s. Welcome to a tale of American triumph, born from Axis underestimation. You're in the desert. It's 1942, and the sky is about to become a killing field. To understand the shock, the sheer disbelief that was about to rock the Luftwaffe, we have to first understand the chessboard. The year is 1941, bleeding into 1942. The world is on fire. In Europe, the Nazi war machine seems unstoppable. In the Pacific, the fate of nations hangs in the balance. And in a seemingly secondary theater, the scorching deserts of North Africa, a brutal war of attrition is raging. This is where the British Empire, on its knees after the fall of France, is making a stand. And now, America is joining the fight. Enter the Yanks. Fresh-faced, confident, and equipped with what they believed was a solid, rugged fighter plane, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. And to be fair, on paper, the P-40 was no slouch. It was tough. It could take a beating and still bring its pilot home. It had a powerful Allison engine and that legendary armament, 6 M2.50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing. When those guns spoke, they didn't just pepper a target, they chewed it to pieces. It was a flying battery, a sledgehammer. But war isn't fought on paper. It's fought in the thin, unforgiving air, miles above the ground. And in that arena, the P-40 had a profound and seemingly fatal weakness. Its performance dropped off a cliff above 15,000 feet. The supercharger, the piece of machinery that keeps an engine breathing thick air at high altitude, was the P-40's Achilles heel. Up high, it became sluggish, a lumbering beast. Now, let's turn our eyes to the opposition. The Messerschmitt Bf 109. This wasn't just a plane, it was a symbol of German engineering and martial prowess. It was sleek, fast, and thanks to its advanced fuel-injected Daimler-Benz engine, it was a demon at high altitude. It could climb, it could dive, it could dance in the thin air where the P-40 struggled to even breathe. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it was a rapier, precise, deadly, and elegant. And the pilots, my God, the pilots. The Luftwaffe in North Africa wasn't just a collection of flyers, it was a brotherhood of aces. Men like Hans-Wilhelm Marseille, the star of Africa. Marseille wasn't just a killer, he was an artist. He would engage enemy formations alone, firing in impossibly deflected shots, his aim so uncanny it seemed supernatural. He racked up an astonishing 158 kills, many of them against what the British called the Tomahawk and Kitty Hawk, the export versions of the P-40. To these German knights of the sky, the P-40 pilots were amateurs. Their planes were inferior. It was, in their minds, almost an unfair fight. You can hear the arrogance in their own words. In his diary, Marseille wrote off the P-40s as easy prey, describing them as slow and predictable. Another ace, after downing one, reportedly quipped it was like shooting a sitting bird. They developed a contempt for the American plane, a belief in their own invincibility. They would dive from the sun from high altitude, where they held all the cards, make a single, slashing attack, and then use their superior energy to climb away, safe and untouchable. It was a tactic born of confidence, bordering on hubris. And for a time it worked. The early days for the American volunteer group, the legendary Flying Tigers, in China had shown the P-40 could be lethal in a specific, brutal kind of fight. But in the wide open skies of the Western Desert, against the cream of the Luftwaffe, the initial results were brutal. American and Allied pilots flying the P-40 suffered. They'd see the contrails of the 109s high above, knowing they couldn't reach them. They'd try to climb to intercept, their engines gasping, only to watch the Germans soar past, laughing. Morale, as you can imagine, took a hit. How do you fight an enemy you can't even touch? This was the psychological battlefield. It wasn't just about speed and climb rates, it was about a narrative. The narrative of German technological and tactical superiority. The myth of the unkillable ace. The story being written in the skies was one of American pluck being beaten down by German genius. The P-40 pilots felt like the Washington Generals to the Luftwaffe's Harlem Globetrotters, pawns in a show designed to make the other side look good. But deep within the American squadrons, a quiet, determined rebellion was brewing. These pilots, these mechanics, these commanders, they weren't just going to roll over. They looked at their obsolete Warhawk and they started to see not its weaknesses, but its strengths. They saw its incredible structural integrity. They saw its stable gun platform. And most of all, they saw those 6.50 caliber machine guns. A single hit from a .50 caliber round could sever a control cable, smash an engine block, or tear a wing off. The 109s, for all their speed, were lighter, more delicate machines. The Americans began to think, to adapt. They stopped trying to play the Germans' game. Why try to climb to meet the 109 in its own domain? That was suicide. Instead, they started to ask a different question. How do we force the 109 to come to us? How do we turn our weakness into a trap? They developed new tactics. They flew lower, using the P-40's superior low-altitude stability and dive acceleration to their advantage. They learned to use the desert itself, flying nap of the earth, using dust storms and heat haze for concealment. They began flying in loose, flexible formations that emphasized mutual support rather than the rigid, pre-war finger four they'd been taught. The most important tactic, the one that would become a hallmark of the Warhawk's success, was the boom and zoom. It was a hit-and-run technique. They would gain what altitude they could, often using cloud cover or the sun to mask their approach. Then, they'd dive, not to dogfight, not to turn with the more agile 109, but to make a single, slashing, high-speed pass. They would pour a concentrated burst of fire from their 6 guns into a single target, and then, using the speed gained in the dive, they would extend away, climbing back to safety before the 109s could react. It was brutal, efficient, and it played directly to the P-40's few strengths. Unit commanders, men like Colonel Philip Cochrane of the 65th Fighter Squadron, drilled these new tactics relentlessly. They studied the mistakes, they debriefed every engagement, they learned from every loss. They fostered a culture of innovation, of defiance. They told their pilots, don't try to outclimb him. Don't try to outturn him. Let him think you're slow. Let him think you're clumsy. Let him get overconfident. And then, when he commits to his dive, when he thinks he has you, you turn the tables. You make him fly into your web. The stage was set. The arrogant aces, convinced of their own superiority, were about to get a very rude awakening. The P-40 pilots, once the hunted, were learning to become the hunters. They were transforming their flying brick into a sledgehammer, waiting for the perfect moment to swing. Because little did the Luftwaffe know, a storm was gathering in the desert heat. A storm of American grit, ingenuity, and raw firepower. And the trigger for that storm was about to be pulled in one of the most one-sided aerial massacres of the war, on a day that would become known to history as Palm Sunday. But before we get to that climax, we need to dive into the cockpit to feel the sweat, the fear, and the rising determination of the men who were about to rewrite the rules of the game. What was it really like to be a P-40 pilot, staring down the legend of the Luftwaffe? And how did one man's desperate, unauthorized act in the heat of battle become the key to unlocking the Warhawk's true, terrifying potential? That's the story we'll uncover next. So there they were. The men of the 57th Fighter Group, the 79th, the 324th. They trained, They'd adapted, they'd honed their new tactics on the dusty training fields of Egypt and Libya. But theory is one thing. The reality of combat against the most feared air force in the world is something else entirely. The transition from the training ground to the killing skies was a brutal, bloody education. This was the crucible. This is where the P-40 and its pilots were forged in fire, and where a single, desperate innovation would change everything. You have to put yourself in that cockpit. It's not the sterile, climate-controlled environment of a modern jet. It's a tiny, cramped metal tube smelling of sweat, high-octane fuel, and cordate. The canopy is a greenhouse, magnifying the North African sun until the interior is an oven. Your leather flight jacket is soaked through. You're constantly drinking tepid, metallic-tasting water from your canteen, fighting off dehydration. And the noise is a constant, deafening roar from the Allison engine just a few feet in front of you, a vibration that becomes a part of your very bones. This was the office of the Warhawk pilot, and it was about to become the most dangerous office in the world. The initial combat encounters were, to put it bluntly, a shock. The first few times a young lieutenant saw a flight of Bf-109s diving on him, it wasn't like the training films. It was a blur of speed, a terrifyingly fast-growing speck that transformed in seconds into a shark-nosed killer, its wings sparking with the fire of its own cannon and machine guns. The 109's 20mm cannon rounds didn't peck at you like rifle-caliber bullets. They exploded. A single hit could blow a wing off. The instinct, the pure, primal human instinct, was to turn, to flee, to try and outmaneuver this thing that was trying to kill you. And that's exactly what the German aces wanted you to do. They wanted you to panic. They wanted you to break formation, to try and turn with them in a horizontal scissors, a dogfight. In that kind of fight, the P-40 was at a severe disadvantage. The 109 was lighter, with a better power-to-weight ratio and a tighter turning radius at high speeds. Many good American pilots were lost in those first few weeks, their Warhawks spiraling down into the desert below, trailing black smoke, simply because they fought the enemy on the enemy's terms. The psychological toll was immense. Pilots would return from missions, their hands shaking so badly they could barely light a cigarette. They'd seen their wingmen, their friends, their tentmates vanish in a fireball. They'd land, count the holes in their own planes, and listen to the ground crew swear as they patched up the damage. The stories of Marseille and the other aces grew in the telling. They became bogeymen, phantoms of the high sun. It bred a feeling of, not hopelessness, but of grim resignation. How do you beat a ghost? The answer came not from a general or a manual, but from the pilots themselves, in the debriefing tents after near-disastrous missions. They'd huddle over crude maps drawn in the sand, using spent shell casings to represent planes. He came down on me from 5 o'clock high. A young pilot, let's call him Lieutenant Joe, would say, his voice still tight with adrenaline. I saw the tracers. I broke left, but he just stuck with me. I couldn't shake him. And an older flight leader, a man with a few more missions under his belt, would nod. You broke left. You turned. Don't turn with him. You see that 109 commit to his dive? You push the nose down. You go vertical. Dive away. Make him follow you into the dive. But sir, he's faster in the dive. Is he? The flight leader would counter. Or is he just starting with more speed? The P-40 is heavy. It builds speed fast in a dive. You push it over, you firewall the throttle, and you go. Don't look back. Just build up speed until you're a blur. Then, when you've got 400, 500 miles an hour on the clock, you pull back easy on the stick, and you climb out. He can't follow you in a high-speed dive like that. His controls will lock up. His wings might come off. Ours won't. This plane, she's built for it. This was the gospel according to experience. They were learning the hard way that the P-40's reputation for being a durable son of a gun was its greatest asset. They began to trust their airframes in a way the 109 pilots couldn't. They'd come back with entire sections of their tail missing, with gaping holes in their wings, and the rugged Warhawk would still bring them home. The legend of the flying tiger from China began to morph. It wasn't just the shark's teeth painted on the nose, it was the plane's very nature. It had a thick skin and a hell of a bite. But there was another problem, a problem of firepower. The 6.50 caliber machine guns were devastating if they hit. But hitting a fast-moving, jinking Bf-109 was incredibly difficult. The standard method was a convergence pattern. The guns in the wings weren't pointed straight ahead, they were angled inward slightly, so that all 6 streams of bullets would converge at a single point in space, usually about 250 to 300 yards out. The idea was to create a concentrated, shotgun blast effect at that specific range. It was a good theory. In practice, it was a nightmare. A pilot hurtling through the sky at 350 miles per hour, trying to lead a target moving just as fast, had a tiny window of opportunity. He had to get the enemy plane perfectly in his sights, at exactly the right range, for a fraction of a second, to achieve a killing shot. If the 109 was closer than the convergence point, the bullets would cross and spread out again, hitting with less concentrated force. If it was farther away, the bullet streams would have already crossed and would be spreading apart, making a hit less likely. It was like trying to thread a needle while riding a roller coaster. The frustration was palpable. Pilots would return to base, swearing they'd poured hundreds of rounds into a 109, seeing strikes sparkle along its fuselage, only to watch it fly away, wounded but still airborne. They called it scratching the paint. They had the sledgehammer, but they couldn't land a solid blow. The German pilots, with their mix of machine guns and high-explosive cannon shells, didn't need the same precision. A single, lucky 20mm hit from them was often a mission kill. And then, one day, in the heat of a desperate fight, something happened. The historical records are often fuzzy on the exact who and when, which is how it often is with true, grassroots innovation. It wasn't a top-down order. It was a pilot, his heart hammering against his ribs, a 109 filling his windscreen, his own tracers seeming to vanish into the empty space around it. In that moment of pure, adrenalized instinct, he did something unauthorized. He didn't just hold the trigger down. He walked his fire. He saw his tracers, those glowing lines of death that let you see where your bullets are going. He saw they were falling behind the 109. So he nudged the stick, just a hair, adjusting his aim. He saw the tracers creep forward, and he watched them walk right up the fuselage of the German plane, from the tail, across the cockpit, and into the engine. It was a fluid, continuous motion, a hose of fire, and in that moment, the 109 didn't just get hit, it disintegrated. The pilot, whoever he was, landed back at his dusty strip, his mind racing. He'd done something he wasn't supposed to do. He'd broken from the rigid doctrine of the convergence pattern. And it had worked. It had worked spectacularly. In the debrief, he tentatively explained what he'd done. Instead of reprimand, he saw the gears turning in his commander's head. Who walked it onto him? The commander asked. Yes, sir. From the tail forward. I just kept the trigger down and guided it in. The concept was revolutionary in its simplicity. They were abandoning the idea of a single, perfect killing shot. Instead, they were embracing the P-40's greatest asset, its immense volume of fire. A P-40 carried over 280 rounds per gun. That's more than 1,600 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition in total. It was a river of lead. Why try to place that river into a tiny teacup at a specific range? Why not use the tracers as a visible guide and simply hose the enemy down, sweeping the river of fire across him until something broke? This became the water hose technique. Pilots were now encouraged to open fire at a slightly longer range and walk their tracers onto the target. It was less about precision and more about saturation. It took advantage of the human brain's incredible ability to make real-time visual corrections. You could see you were missing and you could instantly adjust. It turned the P-40 from a sniper rifle that was hard to aim into a fire hose that could sweep an area clean. The effect was immediate and terrifying. A Bf-109 pilot, used to seeing a quick, discrete burst of fire zip past his canopy, was now confronted with something entirely different. It was a continuous, unwavering stream of glowing red tracers and armor-piercing incendiaries that seemed to hunt him, that curved and swept towards him no matter how he jinked. It was psychologically overwhelming. And when those rounds, even just a few of them, found their mark, the result was catastrophic for the lighter German fighter. The Americans had done it. They had found the key. They had a tough, dependable plane. They had tactics that played to its strengths. And now, they had a way to make its incredible firepower truly effective. The pieces were in place. The trap was set. The hunters were about to become the hunted. The stage for the final, decisive act was the Battle of the Mareth Line in Tunisia, in the spring of 1943. The Luftwaffe, desperate to support Rommel's retreating Afrika Korps, was throwing everything it had into the air. And the Americans, now confident and battle-hardened, were waiting for them. The conditions were perfect for an ambush on a scale no one could have imagined. The date was April 18, 1943, Palm Sunday. And what happened in the skies over the Gulf of Tunis that day would forever shatter the myth of the Luftwaffe's invincibility and cement the legend of the P-40 Warhawk. It would become known as the Palm Sunday Massacre. But what exactly unfolded on that fateful Sunday? How did a simple flight of Warhawks stumble upon the opportunity of a lifetime? And how did the combination of rugged American machines, clever tactics, and that devastating water hose of fire lead to one of the most lopsided aerial victories of the entire Second World War? The answer is a story of timing, courage, and the ultimate price of underestimation. We go now to the climax. The air over the Gulf of Tunis on April 18, 1943, was clear, bright, and deceptively peaceful. It was Palm Sunday, a day of religious significance, a day that should have been quiet. But in war, there are no holidays. For the pilots of the 57th Fighter Group, it was just another day of relentless patrols, of scanning the endless blue for the dark specks that meant death. They were flying their P-40F Warhawks, a model with a slightly more powerful Packard-built Merlin engine, giving them a precious extra edge. They were tired, they were gritty, but they were no longer the green, uncertain boys of a few months before. They were veterans now. They had learned the hard way. And they were hungry. The mission was a routine fighter sweep, an aggressive patrol designed to clear the skies of any German or Italian aircraft trying to interfere with Allied shipping or ground operations. Led by Lieutenant Colonel William "Bill" Lynn, a cool-headed and respected commander, the formation of Warhawks droned steadily over the choppy blue waters of the Mediterranean. Below them, the coast of Tunisia was a smudged brown line. The pilot's eyes, hidden behind sunglasses and goggles, constantly scanned the sectors of the sky, a practiced, nervous dance. They knew the Stukas and Junkers transports were trying to flee Sicily to evacuate key personnel from a collapsing North African front. They were expecting trouble, but what they found was a once-in-a-lifetime target. It was Lieutenant Roy "Duke" Dutton who saw them first. A distant, shimmering cloud to the north, low over the water. At first, it could have been a flock of birds, but it was too large, too structured. He keyed his radio, his voice crackling with a mixture of disbelief and excitement. "Bogies. 10 o'clock low. Many bogies. Many." As they drew closer, the sight that greeted them must have stolen the breath from every man in the formation. It wasn't a flight of fighters. It wasn't a small formation of bombers. It was an air armada, a sprawling, slow-moving, and utterly vulnerable procession of German Junkers Ju-52 transport planes. These were the three-engine Tante-Ju, or anti-Ju, planes, the workhorses of the Luftwaffe. They were slow, ungainly, and lightly armed. And they were packed, absolutely packed, with German troops, seasoned Afrika Korps veterans, specialists, staff officers, being evacuated from Tunisia to the safety of Sicily. Escorting this massive, lumbering fleet were a handful of Messerschmitt Bf 109s and a few Italian Macchi C.202 fighters. They were outnumbered and tasked with defending a flock of sitting ducks. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for. This was the moment all their training, all their adaptation, all their painful lessons had prepared them for. Colonel Lynn didn't hesitate. He gave the order that every fighter pilot dreams of. Tally-ho! Tally-ho! Attack, attack, attack! What followed was not a dogfight. It was not a duel of aerial knights. It was a slaughter, a turkey shoot. The Americans, holding the altitude advantage, nosed their heavy Warhawks over into a screaming dive. The roar of their engines mixed with the rising whistle of wind through gun ports and canopy seams. They were sledgehammers, swung with immense force. The German escort pilots, the few who were there, reacted with bravery, but it was the courage of the doomed. They turned into the diving American horde, trying to break up the attack. But the P-40s didn't take the bait. They ignored the fighters as best they could, their focus laser-like on the fat, slow transports. This was the boom of their boom and zoom tactic on a grand, horrific scale. The first passes were devastating. The P-40s ripped through the formation of Ju-52s at over 400 miles per hour. And now, the unauthorized firing pattern, the water hose technique, became an instrument of biblical destruction. Pilots weren't picking single targets and firing short bursts. They were holding down their triggers and sweeping their 6 guns across the sky. Rivers of .50 caliber tracer fire, glowing red and orange, hosed across the formation. You have to visualize it. A Ju-52, a giant corrugated metal bird, would fly directly into this man-made meteor shower. The .50 caliber rounds, armor-piercing and incendiary, wouldn't just poke holes. They would shred. They sawed wings off. They ignited fuel tanks in brilliant, whooshing fireballs. They ripped open fuselages, and horrified American pilots would see tiny figures, German soldiers, tumbling out into the void, their parachutes sometimes aflame. The sea below began to litter with wreckage and oil slicks. The air itself became thick with the smell of smoke and death, leaking into the American cockpits. One pilot, Captain James Curly Curl, later described it with a soldier's grim efficiency. It was like shooting a rabbit when it's sitting in front of you. You just couldn't miss. Another, Lieutenant John Jock Hennebrey, recalled the surreal horror. They were going down like flies. I saw one Ju-52 try to evade by flying low over the water. I came in on his tail, held the trigger down, and walked the fire right up his fuselage. He just flew into the water and disappeared in a huge geyser of spray and flame. The few German and Italian escorts fought valiantly, desperately. A Bf-109 would latch onto a P-40's tail, its cannon shells exploding around the American plane. But the P-40's ruggedness shone. Time and again, Warhawks would take hits, shudder violently, and keep flying. Their pilots would use their dive speed to break away, then climb back for another pass. The escort fighters were overwhelmed, outnumbered, and outgunned by the sheer volume of fire the Americans were putting out. The P-40's obsolete nature, its weight, its stability, made it a perfect gun platform for this kind of relentless saturation attack. The chaos was absolute. Radio channels were a cacophony of shouts, warnings, and triumphant calls of "Got him!" and "Watch your 6." The sky was a tangled web of tracer fire, burning planes, and blooming parachutes. It was a scene from hell, painted across the beautiful Mediterranean blue. For nearly an hour, the massacre continued. The American pilots, running low on ammunition, would break off, reform, and dive back in, targeting any transport that was still airborne. They showed no mercy because in this war, there was none to be given. When the last of the P-40s, their ammunition drums nearly empty, finally turned for home, the scene behind them was one of utter devastation. The calm waters of the Gulf of Tunis were now a sprawling junkyard. Debris, oil, and bodies bobbed in the waves. A few lone Ju-52s, trailing smoke, desperately tried to limp back towards the coast, only to be picked off by other Allied patrols. The scale of the victory was almost incomprehensible. The final tally was staggering. In that single engagement, the Palm Sunday massacre, Allied fighters, primarily the P-40s of the 57th FG, joined later by Royal Air Force Spitfires and other Allied aircraft, had shot down a confirmed 74 Axis aircraft, the vast majority of them Ju-52 transports. Some estimates placed the number even higher. It was one of the most one-sided aerial victories of the entire Second World War. An entire air transport fleet, hundreds of key personnel, had been wiped out. The Luftwaffe's transport arm in the Mediterranean never recovered from the blow. The P-40 Warhawk, the plane the German aces had mocked as a flying joke, had been the primary instrument of this destruction. Its 6 guns had not just shredded individual Bf-109s, they had shredded an entire strategic plan. They had shattered a myth. The news of the massacre spread through the Allied ranks like wildfire, a massive boost to morale. For the Germans, it was a humiliating, catastrophic defeat. The Star of Africa, Hans-Louis Marseille, was already dead, killed in a flying accident months before. Perhaps it was fate that spared him from witnessing the total collapse of the aura of invincibility he had helped to build. The Palm Sunday massacre was the ultimate vindication of the American way of war: pragmatic, adaptive, and brutally effective. It wasn't about having the best plane on the drawing board. It was about having the right plane with the right pilots, using the right tactics at the exact right moment. The P-40, the underdog, had risen to the occasion and had proven, in the most decisive terms possible, that it was a weapon to be feared. But what was the aftermath of this incredible victory? How did the legend of the P-40 evolve in the final, brutal years of the war? And what is the legacy of this rugged, underestimated warrior, a plane that refused to be counted out? The story doesn't end with the smoke clearing over the Gulf of Tunis. The echoes of those 6 guns would be heard long after the last shot was fired. We turn now to the final chapter and to the legacy left behind by the men who flew the Warhawk and the machine that carried them through hell. The smoke cleared over the Gulf of Tunis. The oil slicks slowly dissipated. The wreckage of the Palm Sunday massacre settled into the silt at the bottom of the Mediterranean, becoming silent, rusting tombs. But the echo of that day, the thunder of the P-46 guns, reverberated far beyond that single patch of water. It traveled through the rest of the war, through the decades that followed, right down to this very moment. The victory was absolute, the tactical impact immense. But what did it all mean? In the immediate aftermath, the mood at the American airfields was a complex cocktail of euphoria, exhaustion, and sober reflection. Pilots who had just hours before been instruments of destruction now sat quietly on empty fuel drums, drinking coffee, their hands still trembling slightly. They had done their job, and they had done it with terrifying efficiency. The ground crews, the unsung heroes, swarmed over the returning Warhawks, slapping the pilots on the back, then getting to work counting bullet holes, patching wings, and reloading the endless belts of .50 caliber ammunition. There was a palpable sense of pride, but it was a grim pride. They had looked into the abyss of total war, and for one afternoon, they had mastered it. The strategic ramifications were immediate. The destruction of that entire air transport fleet was a body blow to the Axis in North Africa. It severed a critical lifeline, stranding thousands of experienced troops and specialists who could have fortified the next defensive line. It crippled the Luftwaffe's ability to conduct large-scale airlift operations in the theater. Within a matter of weeks, the Axis forces in Tunisia, cornered and starved of supplies and reinforcements, would surrender in the hundreds of thousands. The North African campaign was over. The back of the Africa Corps was broken, and the P-40 had played a pivotal, undeniable role in that finale. But the Warhawks' war was far from over. As the Allied juggernaut pushed north into Sicily, Italy, and beyond, the P-40 continued to serve, not as a frontline air superiority fighter against the latest German designs, but in a role it was perhaps always destined for: ground attack. This was the ultimate expression of its character. It was the sledgehammer. Pilots flying P-40NS, the lighter, later model, lightweight Warhawks, found their true calling not in dueling with high-flying 109s, but in tearing apart the German army on the ground. They would load up with 500-pound bombs or clusters of deadly fragmentation bombs. They would streak in at treetop level, their shark's teeth grinning, their 6 guns once again hosing down everything in their path: trucks, tanks, troop concentrations, railway cars. The P-40 became the terror of the Wehrmacht foot soldier. It was durable enough to absorb punishing light flak and keep flying. It was stable enough to make accurate bombing runs. And those 6.50s could turn a column of trucks into a burning scrap metal in seconds. In the hands of pilots like the Jabos of the 79th Fighter Group over Italy, the Warhawk was arguably more effective in this role than it had ever been as a pure fighter. Yet, even as it excelled in this new mission, the narrative was shifting. By 1944, new, gleaming American birds were dominating the European skies. The P-51 Mustang, with its breathtaking range and high-altitude performance, became the darling of the press, the symbol of American air power. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a flying powerhouse, earned its own legendary reputation. The P-40, in comparison, began to fade from the headlines. It was the old workhorse, dependable but no longer glamorous. And this gets to the heart of the P-40's complex legacy. It was never the best fighter of World War II. It would be dishonest to claim that. The Mustang was better. The later model Spitfires were better. The German Focke-Wulf FW-190 was a superior machine. But that's missing the point entirely. The story of the P-40 is not a story about being the best. It's a story about being good enough, and about the men who made it more than enough. The real legacy of the Warhawk is written in the lessons it taught us. It's a testament to the power of adaptation. The Americans were handed a tool that was, on paper, ill-suited for the fight it faced. But instead of giving up, they changed the rules of the game. They looked at their tool's strengths, its toughness, its firepower, its stability, and they built a new way of fighting around them. They developed the boom and zoom. They perfected the water hose firing technique. They turned a perceived weakness into a devastating trap. This is the ultimate refutation of the Axis mindset, particularly the Nazi obsession with technological wonder weapons and racial superiority. The Germans had the better plane, the better aces, at least at the start. But they were trapped by their own doctrine and their own arrogance. They underestimated their opponent. They failed to adapt. The Americans, pragmatic and resourceful, outfought them not with a superior machine, but with superior thinking. The P-40's legacy is also one of sheer, unyielding resilience. It's the story of the underdog. It's the story of the boxer who might not have the fanciest footwork, but who has a chin of granite and a punch that can knock out a horse. Everyone counted it out. The experts dismissed it. The enemy mocked it. And it just kept getting back up, and it just kept swinging that sledgehammer. It's a profoundly American story, but it's also a universal human one. It's about the triumph of grit over glamour, of substance over style. So, what became of the planes and the men? After the war, the thousands of P-40s were quickly scrapped, sold off to other air forces, or simply left to rot in the boneyards. They were a dime a dozen, a tool that had served its purpose. Today, only a handful of airworthy P-40s remain, cherished relics that roar to life at air shows, a fleeting ghost of a bygone era. The men, those young pilots who stared down the Star of Africa, they grew old. They became fathers, grandfathers, businessmen. Many of them rarely spoke of the war, of the things they saw and did over the desert. The memories were too sharp, too real. But their legacy, and the legacy of their rugged, underestimated plane, endures. It endures in the very ethos of the United States military. The emphasis on adaptability, on training, on making the most of what you have. It endures as a powerful cautionary tale against hubris. The German aces who once mocked the P-40 learned the hardest lesson of all: never, ever underestimate your opponent. Underestimation is the fatal flaw of bullies and tyrants throughout history. And finally, the story of the P-40 Warhawk leaves us with a question, a challenge that resonates far beyond the field of history. What is the P-40 in your own life? What is that thing that others have dismissed, that you've been told is obsolete, that you yourself maybe doubt? Is it a skill? A dream? A principle? The world is full of people who will tell you what you can't do, what you don't have, what isn't good enough. The story of the P-40 is a reminder that the tools you have, right now, are enough. You have your own version of that rugged airframe. You have your own 6 guns. You have the capacity to adapt, to innovate, to find a new way to fight. You have the resilience to take a hit and keep flying. The German aces mocked the P-40 Warhawk. They laughed at its design, scorned its pilots, and predicted its easy destruction. They were confident. They were arrogant. They were wrong. Because when the time came, when the trap was sprung and the sledgehammer fell, those 6 guns didn't just fire bullets. They fired a declaration. A declaration written in tracers and thunder, a message that echoes down through the ages: underestimate me at your peril. This story, like so many from World War II, was forged in the courage of ordinary men doing extraordinary things. If this deep dive into the legacy of the P-40 resonated with you, if you felt that thrill of the underdog's triumph, then do us a favor. Share this video with a friend. Let them know about the plane that refused to die. Leave a comment below. We want to hear your thoughts. What's the most underestimated weapon or tool in history, in your opinion? And of course, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We're just getting started, and there are so many more forgotten battles, so many more stories of American grit and ingenuity waiting to be told. We'll see you in the next one. So here we are. The dust of Tunisia has long since settled. The roar of the Allison and Merlin engines is a ghost in the wind, a memory preserved only in grainy film and the trembling stories of old men. The P-40 Warhawks that didn't end up as scrap metal are museum pieces now, silent and polished, their shark's teeth a friendly grin for camera-wielding tourists. It's a peaceful end for a machine born of violence. But if you listen closely, if you stand on the edge of a quiet airfield at dawn, you can still hear it. The echo. It's in the lesson that was written across the North African sky with tracers and courage. A lesson that is as vital today as it was then. The P-40 was never the knight in shining armor. It was the gritty infantryman of the air. It didn't win the war by itself. It was part of a vast, brutal, and collective effort, a tapestry woven with the threads of countless individual acts of bravery, from the pilot walking his fire onto a fleeing junkers to the ground crew chief working through the night by flashlight to get one more Warhawk ready for dawn patrol. The true victory we've chronicled here isn't just measured in kill ratios or the number of aircraft shot down on a single Palm Sunday. The victory was in the shattering of a myth. The myth of inevitability. The myth of innate superiority. The Germans in the desert didn't just believe they had better machines, they believed they were better. They believed in a destiny written by their own technical genius and martial spirit. The P-40, and the men who flew it, tore that page out of their playbook and set it ablaze. They proved that we can trump wonder weapons. That adaptability is a sharper tool than dogma. That a free man, fighting for a cause greater than himself, with a tool he has mastered through ingenuity and sheer force of will, is the most formidable weapon system ever devised. The story of the P-40 Warhawk is a permanent testament to that truth. It's a story that doesn't just belong in the history books. It belongs to anyone who has ever been told they're not good enough. To anyone who has ever been counted out. To anyone who looks at the resources they have and decides, against all odds, to make them work. The German aces are gone. The pilots who defied them are gone. But the echo of those 6 guns remains. It's a whisper on the wind, a timeless reminder. Never mistake simplicity for weakness. Never confuse humility for incapability. And never, ever underestimate the power of a determined underdog armed with a sledgehammer. The sky is quiet now, but the echo is forever.